Well, good afternoon. I'm Rick Wilson. I'm the director of Scientia, and I'd like to thank you for attending today's lecture. This year's series is entitled PANOPLY. I take the meaning to be a broad tapestry of talent, and the aim of the series is to showcase the many different streams of research and ideas here at Rice. Scientia members hope that this is going to encourage cross-school fertilization. To that end, we have three speakers who have been instructed to take 10 to 12 minutes in their talks. Before continuing, I also want to note that Hank Hudspeth died this summer, just shy of his 100th birthday, which I believe would have been right about now. Hank and his wife Damaris long supported Scientia, and their beneficence ensures that Scientia will continue on at Rice. Today's general topic is women in leadership. This is a wonderful topic for this day and age. The lack of women in leadership roles is a persistent and pernicious problem in American society. Indeed, there are more men named John among Republican senators and Fortune 500 CEOs than are women in either of these groups. So, three Rice scholars today will help unpack the political and psychological disparities in American institutions, and more generally to society, and point to some alternatives. This, I hope, will and should inspire an evidence-based, timely, and significant conversation amongst us all. Our first speaker is going to be Eden King, an associate professor of industrial organization psychology from the Department of Psychological Science here. Eden earned her BA in psychology from Rice University, where she also earned her MA and PhD from Rice University. She took her first position at George Mason University in 2006, and boy, Rice was lucky to lure her back in 2017. Her work, which has yielded over 100 scholarly papers, books, and so forth, addresses three primary themes. The first is the current manifestation of discrimination and barriers to work-life balance in organizations. The second is the consequences of such challenges for the targets in their workplaces. And finally, industrial and organizational strategies for reducing discrimination and increasing support for families. She's currently associate editor for the Journal of Management and the Journal of Business and Psychology. Our second speaker, my colleague, Melissa Marschall, is professor of political science and director of the Center for Local Elections and American Politics. Melissa received her BA from the Florida State University and her PhD from Stony Brook. Rice was fortunate to lure her to Texas and to Rice, away from the University of Illinois Chicago Circle in 2003. She has over 100 scholarly books, papers, and book chapters. She's also created and directs the Urban Lab program here at Rice and teaches courses on urban politics, education policy, comparative urban politics, and policy and research methods. Our third speaker, Rosemary Hennessy, is the LV Favrot professor of humanities and chair of the English department. She received her BA from the University of Pennsylvania and PhD from Syracuse University. For a number of years, Rosemary taught at the University of Albany, and in 2006 she was hired here at Rice and became first director of the center? Yeah, that's what I thought. First director of the Center for the Study of Women, Gender, and Sexuality. Her many books cover various facets of Marxist feminist theory on topics ranging from sexuality studies, U.S.-Mexican studies, labor, affect, film, and early 20th century literature. I'm looking forward to these three talks, and I'm going to give way. We'll have the talks proceed one at a time. And with that, Eden.
It is wonderful to see y'all here this afternoon. Thank you for being here and being part of this conversation. I want to start with a question. Here's the question. Have you ever heard of something called the glass ceiling? If you have, raise your hand. It's a common metaphor for the experiences of women once they almost make it to the top of organizations. They look through this metaphorical glass ceiling to the men who sit in positions above them. That's a very powerful metaphor. It's served us well for many years in trying to understand the underrepresentation of women at the highest levels of leadership. But I have a new one for you. And it's one that I came up with when I was playing a game with my 3-year-old daughter. She was supremely frustrated by this game because of what it involved. How many of you have played the game Chutes and Ladders? So, like Chutes and Ladders, men and women often start their careers on the same square. Women, if anything, are getting more degrees, higher levels of education, and they tend to receive job offers that are about the same level, about the same salary as their male peers. But as they roll the dice, they tend to encounter different challenges and opportunities along the way. And as I implied, these challenges are extremely frustrating for 3-year-olds who are playing this game, because all of a sudden you end up on a chute and you have to go all the way back to the beginning of the board. Your object, of course, in this game is to get to the top, to get to the end. And then sometimes you might encounter a ladder, but you have to work really hard to get to the top of that ladder too, in life, not so much in the game. And so this is a metaphor that I want to use to frame a few points I hope to make today. I want to talk about the chutes that women encounter in organizational contexts. I'm going to talk about being overlooked, unheard, excluded, and protected. There's research in social science that suggests that the same cues that imply leadership for men do not convey a leadership authority or position for women. In one study, participants viewed images of people sitting around a table, like at a meeting. And when the person at the head of the table was pictured as a man, what do you think they thought he was? When you're at the head of the table, you're the? Yes, you're the boss. When the same participants and other participants were presented with images where a woman was at that head of the table, that same position, that cue, did not convey the same level of prestige. They were actually, those participants sometimes chose someone else at the table as the boss or the leader. So one of the things that happens in organizational context is that women are overlooked. They're simply not seen as leaders. And this is because of complex stereotypes that I'm happy to talk about in depth when there's more time afterwards. But this is also reflected in anecdotal evidence, perhaps reflected in your own experience, where maybe you're in a group meeting and a stranger, a client or someone who's new to the group comes in and starts talking to the white man in that group as if they were the boss, ignoring the fact that actually it's the Indian woman who's the boss of that table, and their stereotypes influence their patterns of behaviors as they walk in the room. It also explains why women often report feeling like their ideas are overlooked. So a woman might have a suggestion for how to respond to a problem in a team context, and people overlook or don't hear that idea until another man at that same meeting or table raises the same point. And that's another example of a frustrating and common experience that women have in organizational context. Women are also excluded from important social connections at work. One of the things that organizational psychologists study are social networks, and social networks not like Facebook and LinkedIn, but actually how you get your work done, who you talk to at work, and who you go to if you have problems. Those are examples of social networks. So researchers often ask every single individual in an organization, like let's say all the faculty at Rice, that's a big organization, but let's say all the faculty at Rice are asked to indicate who they go to among all the other faculty at Rice when they have a problem. Who do they go to get their work done? And you end up with this complex grid of connections between people. And what the results of these kind of studies suggest is that women's networks look very different than men's, and in important ways. So one important example of this difference is that women are less likely to be directly connected to, and in fact have more connections between themselves and the highest levels of the organization. In other words, women have less access to power or powerful people. They tend to actually have some positives in their social networks. They have stronger support relationships, so they have more people that they can indicate they go to for support, psychological support or psychosocial support, but they have fewer connections to people who have power. So people who might be able or be in a position to nominate them for a promotion or to give them a developmental opportunity. And so women's networks are also one of those chutes that makes it hard for them to get to the top. Women are also protected. This may seem a bit counterintuitive, because in these cases, a form of sexism emerges that doesn't look like the traditional form of sexism that you think about when you think about the notion that maybe women don't fit here, maybe women should not apply, we're only looking for a particular type of person, or even someone directly evoking hostile sexism. Being protected in this case reflects a form of sexism called benevolent sexism. And it stems from the idea that women are the mothers of our children and our own mothers, and so they should be protected and revered and put on a pedestal. And the extent to which men and women endorse that ideology and believe that women are in need of protection is correlated with the extent to which they offer opportunities to their female counterparts or subordinates. So for example, maybe in your organization there's an opportunity to go to a conference in an international destination, or maybe there's an assignment that would require you to participate in really long hours, demanding work. And maybe a boss, man or woman, thinks, I don't want her to have to work too hard, she's got a family at home, she's not going to want to do that. And so that boss will not provide that opportunity to a woman, where they might provide that opportunity to a man in the same role. So this notion that women need to be protected actually undermines women's success at work. And in our own research here at Rice, we have found that the extent to which women are undermined in this way can have severe consequences for their long-term success in organizations. So being undermined, being protected at work is actually very problematic. I also want to mention the ladders. This is the part of the talk where I start to think about, okay, so what can women do? How can they solve this problem? If there's all these issues, what can they do about it? We often tell women that they can walk the thin line, balancing the extent to which they appear to be competent, with the extent to which they appear to be warm, because we know that those are things that help. We also tell women, speak up for yourself and say, I want that challenging assignment, bring it on. You don't have to protect me, I'm ready. We also tell women to network for themselves, to talk to those people in power, to make those connections themselves. And we tell them to challenge themselves, to get those opportunities that they want. But wait a second. Are women the problem here? Maybe, maybe not. We've also begun a new line of research where we're really focused on bringing other people into this conversation. Maybe women can and want to be empowered with these strategies we've studied that we know to be effective in organizations, but maybe, just maybe, other people can help be part of the solution. So we started to try to understand the role of allies in organizations. And what the research suggests is that actually men are really helpful. It's men who are more effective in creating change than women are. If a man stands up and says, this looks like a problem in our organization, let's do something about it, people believe him more, actually rate him more positively, and are more likely to change their behavior than if a woman did the same thing. Men get rewarded for advocating for women, women get punished. So we need men. We need men to be part of this conversation. We need allies. And so we asked women, both women inside academia, but also women in a variety of organizations, about what they want from their peers. What would actually be helpful to them in their roles? What would help them get ahead from the perspective of allies? And what we found were a variety of things. There's lots of things that can be done to help women succeed in organizations. The first is access and opportunity. Women want the opportunities. They want to be seen and heard. So ask for the opinion of everyone at the table. Amplify. If a woman's voice is not heard, amplify it. You could say, hey, that was a great idea when Joan had it. Or you might say, I really liked that idea. Can you say more about it? You can also interrupt bias. Interrupt interruptions, because guess what? Women are more likely to be interrupted than men in these conversations. So you can interrupt interruptions. You can say, hey, I wanted to hear what you said before you got interrupted. Interrupt interruptions. And nominate. Put women on the ballot. Put women up for the positions that actually are associated with power so that they can have access to those opportunities in a way that's equitable. Listening and learning is also an aspect of what women want from their allies. We want people to educate themselves and apply the lessons they've learned. So here today, you're doing it. Good job. Attend these kinds of events, Yeah, go ahead and pat yourself on the back. And learn about it, think about it, have conversations about it so that it sticks with you, so that you actually enact some of the ideas that you hear. We want to be included, and we want to collaborate. We want people to attend our presentations. We want people to ask us to help them and join them in a grant application. We want people to invite us out for coffee at the coffee house. We also want honest feedback. One of the ways that women are protected is that the feedback that we get tends to be less negative. So we tend to not hear all the ways that we need to improve, which is, again, problematic because if we don't know how to improve, then we're never going to get to that next level. We're never going to be qualified for it if we don't learn the new competencies that are required. One point that I recently was reminded of is a colleague who asked me, I'm editing a book and I was inviting chapter authors, and one of the authors I invited said, I would love to be part of this book, but first I need to know. Tell me about the representation of women and people of color among the authors on this book. I have just made a decision, a conscious decision, that I'm not going to be involved in any books or publications that don't have an adequate representation of people from underrepresented backgrounds. And I was blown away. I'd never had anyone say that. Luckily, we were doing pretty well on that front. It was a book about diversity, so that made it easier. But I was so excited that someone called me out on that. So we should do that for each other. I've also heard some colleagues say they won't be on manels. Does everybody know what a manel is? A panel of all men. So next time you get asked to be on a panel, say, I'd love to be on that panel, but can we just check in about the composition? I don't want to be on a manel. There are clear, easy ways we can be allies, but we don't always think about it. It's also important in the case of gender to emphasize and encourage balance. We need to be mindful of the times we're having activities. Are we having family-related activities during times where families are not available? Are we not having family-related activities at all? Is happy hour a big thing? Is that the way people connect? And can women have the same access to that, given that they are the primary caregivers, even in dual earner couples? Women are still responsible for 2/3 of the childcare labor in their homes. Then there's the question of, are women too busy to engage in these kinds of activities? They need to decide. Don't make a decision for one of your subordinates. Let them make the decision for themselves. So with my graduate students even, I have to remind myself of this. I have to say, look, I know this person may have a lot going on, but they still might want access to this opportunity. So I can't withhold it from them because I'm trying to protect them. I have to give them the opportunity and let them decide. Give them the agency. I also would encourage you to share this information with your colleagues. Share what you've learned. Share the importance of diversity, which is a whole nother talk I could give. And also advocate for diversity in everything you do. One aspect of this is dispelling myths. When someone says, hey, there's just no women in the pipeline, go out and find some data and see if that's true. Because often it's not. In the end, what I'd like you to remember is that despite some progress, women continue to encounter disadvantages in the workplace. They are unheard, unseen, excluded, and somehow yet protected in ways that undermine their success. Women can be empowered to address these challenges, but what may be more important and may be more effective is for allies to support change. And of course, institutions themselves can also be change agents through policies and norms that are supportive of equity. And that is yet another talk I would love to give you all some time. Thank you.
All right. I just want to echo Eden and thanking everyone for coming out today. I know it's a glorious fall-like day, and this is kind of a dreary, gloomy room, but thank you. I'm going to continue this conversation about women in leadership, and today I'm going to talk about women running for office. This is a big topic too, and I could spend a lot of time. I'm going to try to condense it and kind of focus on making the case for women running in office and why we should look more at local elections and local politics. And I'm going to talk a little bit about this thing called the pink wave, which hopefully some of you have heard about. So a few facts to know. First fact, women are significantly underrepresented in elective office. That may not be a surprise, and that might be something that you're familiar with. But in 2016, women still had held less than a quarter of top federal, state, and local offices. And this is just a couple of different pie charts to show you that. In Congress, less than 20% in 2016 were women. Statewide offices like the governorship and things like the Railroad Commission, which we have here in Texas, a little under a quarter of women held those seats in 2016. State legislatures, there are about 8,000 legislative seats across the 50 states. Women had just under a quarter of those. And in the largest cities in the US, cities with populations over 30,000, which there are about 1,300 of those, women had only 20% of the governorships in those cities. The second fact is that the problem is not winning elections. Instead, when women run, they tend to win at about the same rate as men. And this is an area where there's quite a bit of research in political science using different types of data. So one method that people have looked at is kind of looking at eligibility pools of people who have the profile of people who might run. And in those studies, they've found that men and women who ended up running were successful at about the same rate. There are other studies that look at women running for general elections for congressional seats and controlling for incumbency and other district characteristics. They tend to find that women are about as successful as men when they run. Other studies have looked at primaries, because maybe that's part of the problem, and we need to look at women running and winning in primaries. And in those, some historical kind of longitudinal studies have found that women of both parties tend to win at about the same rate as men in primaries for US House seats. A third fact is that we know much less about women in local office. And this is partly because there are so many of these local offices and the data for these elections are kind of hard to collect and analyze. But what I want to point out here is that the distinctiveness of local politics and elections suggests that we may not be able to generalize what we know by studying state and federal elections to the local level. And some reasons why local elections are distinctive is that they are overwhelmingly nonpartisan. And what that means is that when you go into the election booth, there are no party labels on the ballots. You just pretty much have someone's name. Many local elections are off-cycle, so just giving you a plug, early voting has started. You may not have even known that there's a local election going on because there's so much talk about the presidential election, which is still more than a year away. But we have started early voting for our local election, which is happening in November. Local elections are happening almost any time of the year if you look at it across the 50 states, so they're happening all the time. Many officers at the local level receive almost no or very little compensation. So these are almost in some cases more like civic duties that people perform. They're not getting paid. And finally, many local races are uncontested. This means that there are no challengers. There's only one person on the ballot, or on the ballot. We did a pretty large-scale study of mayoral races in 6 states going back many election cycles, and what we found that about half of all mayoral elections in those 6 states were uncontested. So that's kind of different from what we see when we look at congressional or state elections. Okay, so that's kind of a little bit of background. I don't expect you guys to follow the political science research and studies, but I hope that you are familiar with the 2018 midterms, and maybe you've heard the term the pink wave. You might have seen some of these headlines, some of these social media stories, news stories. Lots of attention to the large number of women who ran for House elections in 2018. In fact, a pink wave kind of overtook our nation's capital. And it wasn't just media hype. This actually, not fake news. It was real. It happened. This is looking at the total number of female candidates in U.S. House elections going back to the 1970s. And you can see there the 2016 to 2018, pretty sharp increases in the total number of women who ran in these offices for these elections. And when we look at the challengers, these are women that weren't incumbents, women who just decided, hey, why not me? I'm going to run. So we see a pretty sharp increase in both of those trends. So what's driving the pink wave? Is this just a kind of a fleeting moment, or why did this happen when it happened? And there are basically 2 hypotheses here, and these might be familiar to you as well. So the first is a backlash against Trump. So women are unhappy, they don't like Trump, they don't like his policies, they don't like the way he treats women, and they say, you know what, I'm not just going to sit back and complain, I'm going to do something about it, I'm going to run for office. So we might see women running for office in the 2018 midterms for that reason. Another reason is that, or another hypothesis, is the Clinton candidacy. So we have a viable female candidate for president, we're almost there, we thought we were going to be there, we didn't quite get there. There's a lot of people, though, who are kind of still holding on to this I'm with her sentiment. If we're going to get into the presidency, we got to run, we got to win, we got to start somewhere. Why not me? Okay, but is this pink wave really a thing? Is this pink wave really a thing? This is a question. And to answer this question, I'm going to put my map. If you've been to some of my other talks, this is my favorite map. I need to get a new one. This is still from 2007. This is a map of the US that shows local governments. And this shows the number of local governments by counties. And the dark blue, the darkest blue little box there, however the county shape is a county that could have up to 550 local governments within it. So we have a lot of variation just in kind of the density of local governments across the US. The white little boxes, counties, are places where there might only be one government, the county itself. Okay, so we have about 89,000 governments in the United States, and 99% of them are local. So one question is, if we're going to understand women running for office, how are we going to understand that if we tend to only look at the 1% of governments and elections that are out there? What about, you know, the 99% of the other races and elections that are happening, as I said, almost all the time throughout years, even in odd years? So this is kind of a plug that to understand women running, we should look at local. To understand if this pink wave is really a thing, we should be looking more at local elections. So the Center for Local Elections in American Politics has been trying to compile a lot of that local election data so that we can better understand what's happening at the local level. So what I want to show you in the rest of my time is kind of some things that this data can help us understand. And starting off with a sample of 11 states that are representative of that kind of vast variation across the 50 states. We have 50 different systems of local government in the United States. And this just shows you, when we look at the percentage of races that featured at least one female candidate for all the cities in these 11 states, going back to 2005, there is a lot of variation in the percentage of races that had at least one woman. There's a lot of variation, but without knowing anything about these 11 states, it's kind of hard to know what explains that variation. So one thing we might do would be to kind of put on some partisan labels. So do we see more women running in states that are red versus states that are blue? And I don't know about you, but when I look at that, it doesn't really help me organize what we see in that graph. So that's kind of too simplistic of an explanation. It's not just about partisanship or the state partisan context. What about when we look at kind of contextual variation within those states? So what we do see is, as I said, a lot of variation across states. When we look at the percentage of mayoral races that had at least one female candidate, comparing central cities, places like Houston, to suburbs, places like Pearland or Sugar Land, to rural towns, places like Beesville, Texas, which is the county seat of Bee County in Texas, in case anyone's ever been there. Here we see a lot of variation. So almost half of mayoral elections in central cities had at least one female candidate. About a third of mayoral elections in these 11 states had a female candidate in the suburbs, if they were in the suburbs, and less than a quarter of rural towns had mayoral races that had at least one candidate. What about variation across partisan and nonpartisan? I said partisan elections are relatively rare. In our sample, we have a couple of states, Connecticut, Indiana, Louisiana, and Rhode Island have all partisan local elections. There's a handful of those in Kentucky and North Carolina. But we do see actually more women candidates in partisan races than in nonpartisan races. So we see some variation there. And then if we look at it across election timing, so they have the electorate is more representative of the population as a whole during presidential or midterm elections. And in off-cycle elections, we tend to see relatively low turnout. Sometimes 10, 12% of people are turning out. But what we see here is that women are more likely to run in those off-cycle races. So we're seeing some interesting variation when we start to look at who's running for mayor across different types of cities and different types of local elections. So women are more likely to run for mayor in central cities, when there's partisan races, and in off-cycle elections. What about this pink wave? So we're coming back to this question of whether this pink wave really is a thing, and can we see evidence of it when we look at mayoral elections? Okay, so because local elections are complicated, it's not that easy to compare. We want to compare apples to apples and oranges to oranges, and it's still unfolding. So we haven't actually had an election post-2016 in all of the places that are in this sample. But when we look at the first cycle, the cities that had elections in 2017, right after the Trump presidency, and we compare those to the 4 years prior, the last time in which most of these places had an election, we do see a relatively big bump. So we're pooling together, again, all these states, looking at 2 election cycles before and kind of what happened after the 26th election. We see about a 5 percentage point increase in races that featured at least one female candidate. And look at there at the midterm, the 2018, the pink wave. This was the pink wave in Congress, and we see no evidence of a pink wave at all when it comes to local. And maybe it's because all those women were busy running for congressional offices. We don't know. But when we look ahead in the 2019 cycle, and there are 3 states in our sample that are still waiting. They're going to have their elections in November just like us, North Carolina, Washington, and Connecticut. We don't see so much of a boost in women running. So evidence of the pink wave when we're looking at mayoral elections, at least at this point, doesn't seem so strong. But again, it's still unfolding. And what we might want to do is look a little bit more carefully, look a little bit more closely within these states to see where we might see some variation. So we shouldn't expect maybe to see the same pattern everywhere. So where might we see some stronger evidence of the pink wave? So we're going to look at red and blue states, and we already saw a lot of variation across context. If we compare rural to suburban to central cities, and this is the set of blue states in our sample, the Minnesotas, the California, these cities. And what we see here is not much going on in rural and suburban. We don't see a very big increase in women running for mayor in these contexts, but we see a huge increase in women running in mayoral elections in central cities. So there's definitely a pink wave going on in cities, in blue states. We look at the same thing in red states. We see a slightly different pattern. We see actually something interesting happening in rural America. Not only are there more women running for mayor in rural elections in rural places in red states overall, but we see a larger increase after the 2016 election of women running for mayor in these rural towns. Again, nothing really happening in the suburban locations. And we see the same boost in women running in cities in red states that we saw in blue states, but not quite as big. So all this to say is that there's lots that we can look at in terms of this question of the pink wave and whether it exists and where it exists. And I am trying to convince all of you that we should pay more attention to local elections. They're understudied and underappreciated. We think they can tell us a lot, not only about how our representative institutions of government are working, but how well our democracy is functioning. Can have some insights about this pink wave, whether it's fleeting or whether it's going to be sustained. Are we going to see women continuing to run? And we know that when they run, they tend to win at about the same rates. What we really need, is kind of a pipeline issue, is more women running. And I'm going to leave you with this image. We're about to commemorate the 100-year anniversary. They didn't call it a pink wave in 1920. They were called the Petticoat Council, an all-women's council in 1920. Maybe that's the last time. I've actually never seen an all-women council in other cities, but they're about to celebrate their 100-year anniversary. So thanks for listening, and I'm going to turn it over to Rosemary.
Well, they called this a panoply, and I think you're really going to see it now in our very different disciplinary habits. On the first page of Toni Morrison's brilliant novel entitled A Mercy, the narrator, a young girl named Florence, puts forward 2 oblique and haunting questions to her interlocutor. One question, Florence asserts, is who is responsible? Another is, can you read? She doesn't spell out how the questions might be connected, although we intuit that responsibility must in some essential way be tied to literacy, and as the novel goes on so eloquently to disclose, to a reading practice that makes signs answerable to history and to what will come. My contribution to today's topic invites us to consider women and leadership from the vantage point of a feminist practice of reading and of leading. More specifically, I want to make a bold argument for feminism as a responsible reading practice that is foundational to effective leadership. As I'm using it, the phrase reading practice is a shorthand for a way of making sense. What ways of making sense become cultural obvious or are marginalized as radical, for example, is both a sight and a stake in politics. As a reading practice, feminism is hardly homogeneous, of course. One of the intellectual, which is to say political, commitments of feminism's mission in the university and in the wide world is to maintain the value of this diversity while also continually assessing the reasons for the difference and the histories that shape the stories we tell, the questions they allow us to ask, and the answers they lead to or foreclose. The feminist standpoint I want to talk about today becomes responsible knowledge when it inquires into the roots of a problem and aims for less partial ways of understanding it. Such a standpoint recognizes our fundamental human dependency and accepts it as the basis of our responsibility. It also presupposes that this dependency is crucial to our survival, as it is organized and at times eclipsed through the relations of labor, power, and culture that we devise. This way of reading acknowledges that the responsibility for maintaining life entails human and non-human life forms, as well as the care that is crucial to maintaining them. It concedes that capitalism is a global organization of life and pays special attention to the cultural inventions of race, gender, and sex as they shape the calculus of value that feeds the accumulation of property and wealth. So long as gender, sexuality, and race remain vectors of power through which value is accumulated by the few, their place in how we read remains historically urgent. Such a standpoint is based in the needs of the many and answerable to a collective process that is indispensable to imagining and organizing alternatives. In the years I conducted research among workers on the northern border of Mexico, I witnessed and at times participated in forms of education and organizing that exemplified such leadership on the part of many women from many different sectors. This leadership didn't use the term feminist, but often it was in fact promoting the kind of leadership I've been talking about and such a feminist way of reading. And it was for me and for many others profoundly transformative. In May 2003, a woman named Rosario Acosta from the city of Juarez, Mexico, spoke with me about the growing number of murdered and disappeared girls and women in that city since 1993, and the state's systematic abandonment of their families. After her 10-year-old niece was abducted and murdered, she decided to take action. Speaking with clarity and deliberation about the events surrounding her niece's disappearance, she said that at first she hammered away at unresponsive authorities, acting as an individual citizen, advocating on behalf of her family. Then, in frustration at the lack of official attention to her niece's case, she quit her job as an accountant and joined other families of the disappeared, many of them poor girls working in the maquiladoras, the factories. With them, she helped form an organization called Bring Our Daughters Home. In her speeches across Mexico and the United States as a representative of the group, Rosario focused on the problem of visibility and reading. How one sees the situation depends on statistics, sources of information, she said. But she also pointed to the giant puzzle of the Mexican government's impunity and the repression that amounts to a general and normalized moral abandonment that blocks access to justice. In the face of this coordinated wall of indifference, she solicited solidarity and collective action. One's perception is also conditioned by the lies, she said, because this didn't happen by chance. These events occurred within a context that doesn't only consist of the history of these murders. Rosario Acosta's account of coming to terms with her niece's death transforms one woman's unspeakable loss into a set of demands that discloses the roots of violence and their systemic reach. She points not only to violence against women per se, but also to conditions that place certain subjects in the crosshairs of capital. She articulates her niece's murder as a problem of visibility tied to the impunity of corporate governmentality and to forces of repression that solicit consent to systemic relations in which a child's murder is only one part. How one sees the situation, she reminds us, depends on the history we understand. Her critical re-narration draws out the relations that condition the violence, including the integral role of gender in them, and offers an analytic that is portable to other situations where states abnegate responsibility to the people in favor of serving those who control the management of capital flows. Rosario is an ordinary woman who dared to name who is responsible for the violence, to assume responsibility herself for redressing it, and to step up to lead a grassroots movement in the face of enormous obstacles. Her story teaches us important lessons about women and leadership. It springs from a way of reading that attends to individual lives, but doesn't adopt an individual standpoint. It aspires to a more ample account of the relations organizing our lives and inspires collective action. Such a way of reading has leavened women's good sense and visions of possibility in workshops and around kitchen tables, in classrooms and community centers, both with and without the name feminist. My current research looks at the writings of U.S. women in the 1930s. This was a challenging decade, but also a time when misery created political openings for big structural change. Women writers became a part of that change by raising their voices and joining organizing efforts that for many of them disrupted their middle-class assumptions and values. Writing for a popular magazine about her involvement in the Minneapolis strike of 1934, Mary Delesseur captured the way it altered her sense of responsibility through what she called a psychic change. The truth is, I was afraid, she wrote, not of the physical danger at all, but of an awful fright of mixing, of losing myself, of being unknown and lost, that all I had been trained to excel in would go unnoticed. I felt I excelled in competing with others, and I knew instantly that these people were not competing at all. And I was filled with longing to act with them and with fear that I could not. She went on to write for decades out of that psychic change that overcoming fear entailed. I mention her here in the context of our discussion of women in leadership because her words speak to us as people working in the university during dark times. And they underscore the deep-seated stakes of our discussion. Our life seems to be marked with a curious and muffled violence over America, Lasser wrote in that essay of 1934. In these terrible happenings, you cannot be neutral. These examples from different times and places illustrate that women have practiced a form of leadership I am describing, even when the statistics and their own class history seem to confirm that they faced insurmountable obstacles. If the empirical evidence for women's leadership is discouraging, I think it's still important to remember that women have led and done so against the odds. In fact, such leadership took place right here on this campus on Inauguration Day in January 2017. I could say that it was led by two women who were newly hired assistant professors, and that's true. But their idea grew into a day of sustained inquiry that in fact was led by scores of faculty, students, and staff from across the university, gathering to respond to a historical crisis. Workshops took place on topics such as the histories and cultures of dissent, health and reproductive rights, the climate crisis, and immigration. They enacted an insistent and untimely collaborative leadership that responded to the urgencies of the present by enabling us to pause, to make connections, and to make legible history's abiding provision of responsible knowledge. In the 2 years since, individual women around the world, often unsung, are altering the conception and practice of leadership. Women like Patrisse Cullors, Alicia Garza, and Opal Tometi, co-founders of Black Lives Matter. Tarana Burke, the first to use the Me Too hashtag in her work on violence against women. Or 16-year-old Greta Thunberg, who's organizing millions to demand official leaders address the climate crisis. Who is responsible? Can you read? Feminism's answer to these questions is a practice of reading that aims not for absolute truths, but for less partial accounting of history and of what is, and that fosters collective imagination of what can be. This way of reading derives its power from our most precious asset, our mutual dependency that can transform fear into demand and responsibility into a common undertaking. If you listen carefully, I think you might even hear it in this room.